Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is Episode 8. In this episode on understanding postmormonism and the faith crisis movement, we are going to comment on a specific generational demographic within the church. That is, our youth in general and the millennials in particular. This means that we will be covering both millennials and postmillennials, with millennials being those who were born between 1981 and 1996, and postmillennials being those who were born after 1996 to the present. The reason for singling out this specific age group is because of the unusual challenges the church faces in this internet and information age in retaining its younger demographics within the church. To get to the heart of the matter, and in an effort to personalize this series of episodes, I have decided to incorporate segments of a YouTube video that has recently surfaced and which has gained a great number of views and which personalizes and summarizes quite nicely what this particular YouTuber believes to be the three major reasons why millennials are leaving the church. Since the individual who put together this YouTube video on why millennials are leaving the church is himself a millennial, I thought it might be helpful if I made a few comments about millennials before we started viewing these selected video segments. No, I don't agree with everything this millennial is going to say about the church. But yes, I am going to do my best to lay out and explain what I think he is trying to get at. After all, if the older generations within the church are ever going to have a last and legitimate chance of reconnecting with the younger generations before we leave this earth, then we have got to at least take the time to hear them out. We may not agree and probably won't agree, but we do need to listen and at least try to understand where they are coming from and as to why it is that they are saying what they are saying. If one listens carefully and reads between the lines, one will come to understand that there is a lot more going on with these millennials than meets the eye. For instance, you will discover that, for the most part, baby boomers are far more gospel-oriented than cause-oriented, as is evidenced by their wholehearted adherence to the plan of salvation, especially in the twilight years of their lives. While millennials and postmillennials, who have their whole lives before them, are often far more cause-oriented than gospel-oriented, as is evidenced by their wholehearted activism in support of this or that liberal agenda or progressive cause, with very serious and profound implications for our understanding of the gospel and the plan of salvation. And so listening does not mean capitulating. In fact, I'll have a great deal to say about millennials and this particular disconnect after we have viewed the various segments of this video, and after we have laid out the various parameters of this threefold argument as to why millennials are leaving the church. Let's turn then to this YouTube video. The channel username for this YouTube video is That Mormon Boy, and he has titled this video Three Nails in a Coffin, with the subtitle of Why Mormons Continue to Leave. And by that he means leave the church. In fact, after viewing this video, I think you will agree with me that it should have been subtitled Why Latter-day Saint Millennials Continue to Leave, since he is mostly concerned with commenting on this particular age group. In any event, he begins by making a passionate plea to the leaders of the church to pay attention to what is going on with his generation and the youth of the church, because with social media, the internet, and this information age, they are going to be exposed to so many upsetting and disturbing accounts of Joseph Smith and church history, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. And then he goes on to say that it's 2020 now, and like it or not, an unstoppable wave is coming, and you're going to start losing my generation if something is not done to stop the hemorrhaging. But let's take a couple of minutes to let him speak for himself.
You have to confront with the internet, with this age of information, young people, all of them, unfortunately, I told you guys this in 2005. I started talking about this, started talking to institute instructors about this, started sending letters to general authorities about this. I said, a wave is coming. You're going to start losing my generation. The social media, information technology, the internet, free information to all of church history. You're not going to be able to tell people anymore that's not necessary for your salvation, or you shouldn't be thinking about that, or that's anti-Mormon literature. You're not going to be able to tell people that anymore. It's coming. And you're going to start seeing the church hemorrhage young people. And I was absolutely right. It's 2020 now. So now nobody questions this anymore. Everybody knows that my generation has been leaving the church in droves. I'm not saying, by the way, that the church is going to collapse, or it's on its last leg, or that it's like the sinking ship, like the Titanic. The truth is, Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is stronger than it's ever been. And it's going to continue to grow. I don't think that it's on its way out, or that it's corrupt and blah, 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 it's failing. But let's be freaking real. The church is hemorrhaging young people. Period. We need to be real about that. I don't know why people saying that, like, that's made me an enemy. People have thought that I was an apostate, an anti-Mormon. People have called for me to be disciplined. It's 2020, you know.
In this episode, then, we are going to take his passionate plea to take this hemorrhaging of our youth and millennials seriously by taking a look at each of the 3 nails in the coffin that he identifies as doing the most harm. And I'll do my best to try and lay out what he is saying in order to help make sense of it all going forward. He begins by introducing the idea that for younger Mormons, there are 3 stakes in the heart, or better yet, 3 nails in the coffin that seal the deal and account for their leaving the church. Let's take a minute to hear him out.
There are 3 stakes. Think about it as 3 stakes, or better yet, 3 nails in the coffin. That most of my generation, most of the younger Mormons that are leaving, they get these 3 same nails in the coffin that seal the deal for them and cause them to walk away from Mormonism.
With that short introduction, he then jumps in and goes through each nail in the coffin 1 nail at a time. However, he is a little confused or unclear on how he goes about differentiating between 1 nail in the coffin and another, and often overlaps them to a greater or lesser extent throughout the video. Nonetheless, it is easy to see what he means by each coffin nail, and so I have taken the liberty of creating a chart or table to lay out these 3 distinct categories or nails in the coffin for you, so that as he discusses each of them, we are able to keep track of where we are and as to what is going on in the heads of the millennials as we move from one coffin nail to another and then to another. The first nail in the coffin for millennials is church history and consists in all the hidden details pertaining to the life of Joseph Smith and the early origins of the church, details that the great majority of Latter-day Saints know little about and which the millennials within the church are having to come to terms with on their own and without any forewarning of the often shocking and upsetting nature of the materials they are being confronted with on the internet. Let's hear what he has to say then about this first nail in the coffin.
All right, the nail number 1 is just like church history, teachings, doctrines, practices. Anyway, so what this first stake that I'm talking about, which is, again, church history, policies, practices, teachings, doctrines, that's kind of the first stake or nail in the coffin. That's the first wrecking ball that's going to hit you as a young Mormon. So you're going to start learning all of these super, super difficult, controversial things that the church denies that it's hiding, but essentially, effectively, the church is hiding these things through, or was. The church has been doing a lot better, and I have to point that out. It's awesome. Okay, there's been tremendous strides. Nevertheless, that is a huge stake. So to understand why people are leaving in context, you have to understand that. Now, people have compared that first stake, that first wave, as books on a shelf. They say, you can only put so many doubts on the bookshelf. You can only say, oh, let's put a pin in that. Let's shelf it for a little while. I'm just going to put that on the shelf. The Book of Abraham, there's lots of questions I'm starting to have there. I'm just going to put that on the shelf too. And the more stuff you put on the shelf eventually is going to give, and the floodgate's going to open. Okay, but that's only one pillar. That's not the reason people are leaving. Okay, that will crush people's testimonies. That will, all these things. People do leave, of course, for those things, but that's actually, if you think that's the problem, you still don't fully understand. So let's go on to nail number 2, the second nail in the coffin.
The second nail in the coffin for these millennials is equally unsettling, and that is the church policies pertaining to social issues. I know he says church behavior, or when the rubber hits the road, but this behavior is based on its policies. So this is where part of the confusion and overlap comes in. To keep it clear, we are going to refer to this second nail in the coffin as church policies, and as they relate to major social issues, such as the policies in the past pertaining to blacks in the priesthood, or policies in the present pertaining to homosexuality, gender issues, and same-sex marriages. He then goes on to note that for these millennials, these church policies pertaining to past and present social issues are often far more upsetting and deal-breaking than are the numerous concerns revolving around church history. In any event, for millennials, these church policies relating to social issues represent for him the second nail in the coffin. Again, let's hear what he has to say.
So let's go on to nail number 2. The second nail in the coffin is very important to young people, very important to millennials, and younger, and maybe some Gen X too. So, although millennials kind of seem to be the ones that really started being bothered by this, but it's how the church has actually acted and behaved in the real world. So now we're not talking about teachings or policies or practices or doctrines or revelations or church history. Now we're not talking about that. Now we're talking about something entirely different. How the church is actually behaving when the rubber meets the road, when it's confronted with real social issues. How does the church and its leadership and Mormons in general, how do they behave socially? Well, unfortunately, that's just as disturbing as the first nail in the coffin, because if you go back, the church, were they progressive on interracial marriage? Did Mormons lead the charge? No. They fought against interracial marriage. One drop of Negro blood. I mean, oh my gosh. And then you go to almost every single social issue. So this is how the church is acting in the real world when there really are moral, ethical, or intellectual issues that it confronts. Gay marriage, right? Geez Louise. I mean, the list goes on and on and on when it comes to actual real world issues that the church is getting wrong. And yes, of course. Now here's where it's going to be frustrating for young people, because they're going to be bothered by this. They're going to bring it up to their church leaders, and their church leaders will say some cop-out answer like, well, the church is neutral. It doesn't take an official stance. So that way it's like you create this kind of deniability where, oh no, we never were really against the civil rights movement. We never were really against evolution. We never were really saying that homosexuality was a perversion. It was a mental illness. No. We didn't the church didn't officially endorse those things. We never officially said that you should get married if you're gay and that will make you straight. We never officially did that. So it's really, so what that comes across as inauthentic. That becomes across as like dishonest apologetics, like you're playing a game now. Okay? And so this hurts. You got to understand, for young people, they're not trying to play a game. They're not trying to criticize the church. They're not trying to play apologetics or anything. And when church leaders respond like that, that authentically wounds them. And it's somewhere in step 1 or step 2, nail 1, nail 2, that these young people are starting to be treated like enemies, which brings me to step 3, the final nail in the coffin.
The third nail in the coffin pertains to church discipline and to what is real or perceived to be personal attacks on anyone who has doubts, raises questions, or expresses misgivings while dealing with the hidden details of church history or the social issues associated with past and present church policies. As you listen to this description of this third nail in the coffin, you will hear him state that this third nail is the biggest and most painful of the 3 nails, and that it literally dwarfs the first 2. I'll explain later what I think he is trying to say, but I think he overstates his case, and as a result, he undermines the seriousness of the first 2 nails in the coffin by implying that if the leaders of the church would simply stay away from the personal attacks, quit playing the blame game, and actually address the issues at hand, rather than dancing around them, that the issues themselves would somehow become more of a secondary rather than a primary concern. In any event, hear him out, because it is obvious that it was this third nail in the coffin that bothered him more than any other, because of what for him was its personal, hurtful, and painful nature. After all, he explains, you're in the midst of an existential crisis, a faith crisis where everything is on the line, and instead of helping you work your way through the crisis, you're either accused of being out of touch with the Spirit or of listening to Satan, and then you're labeled an apostate, or simply sent home to read the Scriptures, attend church, and serve more until the crisis passes. But he points out the crisis doesn't pass, because regardless of how hard you pray or serve others, these 3 issues still remain and are not going away. With that having been said, let's hear what he has to say.
If you want to understand why young people leave the church in droves, if you want to authentically, truly, holistically, and empathetically understand this, then here's the final nail in the coffin. That is, this is when it gets personal. So the first one was like doctrine and history and problems with that. The second one was when the church actually behaved, when the church leaders, church members, when Mormonism actually performed in the real world on social issues, how did it do, right? And then the third one is totally personal, just to you. How is the church treating you while you're dealing with these things? This is the biggest and most painful nail in the coffin. That's why I call it the final nail. Believe it or not, this nail dwarfs the first nail. Believe it or not. And it's way larger than the second nail. It's like they go up in size every time. This is the final nail. This is when the church is actually connecting to you personally and dealing with you personally as you experience nail 1 and nail 2. See, this is where you're going to be ostracized. This is where you're going to be treated like an apostate or an anti-Mormon. I think church leaders, and I know that I'm alone on, I'm really alone on this. People don't feel this way. So this is how I feel. They are genuinely loving, compassionate, inspired men who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. Look, when people try to seek inspiration, I think they get it, regardless of who they are and what church they're a part of. And I think that Mormon leadership are genuinely, much of the time, genuinely trying to do what's right and seek inspiration and help. So anyway, let's get back to step number 3, to the nail number 3. this is personal, because this is when you are actually interfacing with church leaders, or trusted church members, or mentors, or maybe actual leadership, maybe institute directors, maybe general authorities. Like I talked to institute directors and general authorities when I was going through this process. And they themselves are telling you things like, look, Satan is getting a hold of your heart. Like, Satan is inspiring you. Where do doubts come from? Doubts come from Satan, not from the Spirit. So Satan is gaining power over you. So you really need to look and repent. And he said, no, but I am reading my scriptures. I am going to the temple. I'm not looking at pornography. I'm not doing any of those things. Well, listen, Rio, you shouldn't be focusing on those things. You should be serving in the church, and you should be praying to Heavenly Father, reading the Book of Mormon daily, participating in your calling, keeping the Spirit with you, okay, and worship Christ and follow Christ, and Heavenly Father will take care of those things. Those won't be issues for you anymore. The reason that these are issues for you is because you're losing grip, brother. Satan, but okay, so this is me. Like, okay, I understand you're telling me that I'm losing grip and I'm following Satan and I'm falling into a trap or whatever. So it's this dance. I've been through this, oh my gosh, probably hundreds of times with all sorts of church leaders and church people. And it is the most painful, grueling. The church people are actually like it's like mental torture. It's like the ultimate form of gaslighting. Like, your doubts don't matter. They're not real. You're focusing on the wrong things. That's not necessary for your salvation. You have hidden sins that you're not repenting of. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And this stuff absolutely still happens. Absolutely. Or what's even maybe potentially more painful is when they do start to talk about the issues with you, but they do the apologetic dance. And you go down these rabbit holes with apologetics, and they try and, again, make you think that this is all in your head. It's not a big deal. It doesn't matter. Your questions are not intellectual. There's no merit. We don't have any information. Therefore, it's ridiculous that you're doubting. Just go back to reading your scriptures and go to church. And so when someone like me, when my generation, we go through these nails in the coffin, the final nail is when we personally are rejected or punished or excommunicated or disfellowshipped or whatever, merely for having the doubts, for going through these things. And then we get angry eventually for being played with and being told that we're unworthy and being told all these things. It's such a painful process that eventually we start to get angry. And then we actually are lashing out and raising our voice in an interview with a bishop or something. And then they say, well, see, you've lost the Spirit, right? And then we start to become, they start to cast us as the enemy. So we're carrying a scarlet letter. And so that's what cuts the cord. That's the final nail.
Before commenting on these 3 nails in the coffin and the urgency of taking them seriously, let me attempt to explain what I think he had in mind by referring to this 3rd nail in the coffin as the biggest and most painful of the 3 nails, and that it is this 3rd nail which dwarfs the other 2. Consider this roller coaster ride with 3 major loops, tipping points, or sudden drops which progressively increase in height, speed, and in intensity the further along the ride you go. Now imagine that with each tipping point, you lose a number of your passengers due to the intensity of the ride, so that by the time you get to the 3rd tipping point, nearly all of the passengers have either bailed out or have already been thrown out of their roller coaster cars. Now it is true that the 3rd tipping point is the highest and most intense. But notice that this is only true of the few passengers who remain and who actually made it this far, while the majority of the other passengers had long ago bailed out on their own. From what I have been able to observe, church history, or the first tipping point, is where we lose the largest number of Latter-day Saints to this red pilling and this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis. Many of those who survive the height and intensity of the first tipping point are not at all prepared to deal with the added height and intensity of the second tipping point, which are the church policies pertaining to past and present social issues. Particularly if a family member or personal friend of theirs is caught up in the all too often tragic downside of this or that church policy. But even then, there are those members and millennials who hold on and tough it through the first two tipping points, only to ratchet it up a notch by ascending to the greater heights and intensity of the third and final tipping point. That is, church discipline, along with its real or perceived personal attacks. Yes, this can be the highest and the most intense part of the ride, but only for those few who actually make it this far. Notice the orange flag marking the end of the ride, and the fact that there is but one set of passengers who actually survive the ordeal. Apparently, the individual who broadcast the YouTube video we just listened to was one of the few millennial survivors to make it through all three tipping points without bailing out or being tossed out. Unfortunately, he knows that as things stand right now, nothing has changed, and so he is condemned to riding and watching the same disastrous outcome repeat itself over and over again as passengers either bail out or are thrown out with no end to this senseless madness in sight. Hence the deep feeling of personal concern, frustration, and regret that things are the way they are in the church and that something needs to be done now, not later. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself as to just exactly what these millennials expect the church to do in response to these incriminating allegations and urgent calls for change. In other words, just what sort of an official response from the church will actually satisfy the demands of the millennials. And do not be mistaken, they are demands, not requests. More about that later in the next episode. In any event, what are these demands? Well, in a simplified form, and based on these three nails in the coffin, they are the following. First, come clean, meaning no more secrets when it comes to church history. Second, wake up, meaning no more missteps when it comes to church policies and current social issues. And lastly, get real, meaning no more games when it comes to church disciplinary action against those millennials caught in the midst of a faith crisis. And so we see that the threefold argument being made is that if the church will simply come clean, wake up, and get real, it can stop the hemorrhaging of our young people. At least that is the underlying assumption in this YouTube video. In any event, let us allow him to close out his argument with a summary of these three nails in the coffin and as to why millennials are leaving the church.
So these three main things, the doctrine and history, the social issues, the actual performance when rubber meets the road, and then the personal performance, how the church actually treats you personally as you deal with real things. Those are the three issues that are just killing us. It's like the perfect formula to just drive away an entire generation. All right, said my piece. Thanks.
As we viewed this YouTube video, one could easily see a problem-solution formula being followed throughout, with the problem being laid out under the official headline of Three Nails in the Coffin, with church history, church policies, and church discipline being the three problem areas confronting the millennials. And then the solution falling under the unofficial headline of Three Demands on the Church, with the three non-negotiable demands, and they are demands not requests, of come clean, wake up, and get real, matching up and corresponding to each of the three problem areas. The idea is, of course, that if church leaders truly wish to stop the hemorrhaging of millennials from the church, then the best way to go about this would be to offset these various problems with the proposed solutions. It is also interesting to note that the YouTuber was very emphatic throughout the video that if the church would but follow this threefold solution of come clean, wake up, and get real, that the millennials would not up and leave the church anyway, as many might suppose, but would absolutely stay in the church. This he all but guaranteed, as he insisted that all that millennials really were looking for out of their church leaders was authenticity and transparency, suggesting that all else could be either forgiven or forgotten over time. At this point, I would like to ask if you agree or disagree with what this YouTuber adamantly argues for and insists upon in this YouTube video. That is, do you agree or disagree that millennials will not leave the church if the church will but come clean, wake up, and get real? Think about it before you answer, because the stakes are sky high, and there is a lot riding on your answer for both the millennials within the church and for the church itself. There is also a lot riding on the underlying assumption in this exercise, and that is this assumption that the church truly does need to come clean, wake up, and get real, as this YouTuber suggests. What if he is wrong? And further, what if this YouTuber is wrong because he hasn't taken into consideration the powerful influences of the far wider social, cultural, and political contexts that exist outside the religious faith and personal concerns pertaining to one's church? And even further, what if there is something far more serious than a faith crisis going on here? What if millennials and postmillennials in general are caught up in something far bigger and far more threatening and precarious than a Latter-day Saint faith crisis? It is said that when it comes to life's problems, that some things are small potatoes compared to the larger ones. And what I would like to suggest to these millennials and postmillennials is that a Latter-day Saint faith crisis is small potatoes compared to the big-sized potatoes or crisis that is coming our way, both within and without the church. The fact that most millennials and postmillennials are at the forefront of this bigger cultural crisis, and far more so than are the baby boomers and Gen X generations, makes this prognosis of our societal demise, looming large on the horizon, all that more difficult, as I am not here to pick on the millennials and postmillennials, but on the contrary, I'm here to sway as many Latter-day Saint millennials and postmillennials as possible to turn away from the powerful influences of this wider social, cultural, and political context and help avert a disaster of biblical proportions. Together, this coming cultural crisis can be averted, but not without the millennials and postmillennials making a dramatic, unexpected, and life-altering shift in their way of thinking about the world in which they live. Let me explain. Let me begin this explanation by making an observation about Latter-day Saint millennials and this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis that will certainly surprise many of you, particularly those millennials or post-millennials who have already experienced or are currently in the process of experiencing this faith crisis. In any case, stick with me, because things are about to get even more controversial and unpredictable than before. Here then is my first observation. Millennials don't leave the church because of troubling church issues. And by that I mean simply because of the 3 nails in the coffin discussed earlier. Yes, these troubling church issues are at the forefront of their faith crisis, but that is not ultimately why they leave. So this first observation leads me to a second and equally startling claim, and that is that millennials leave the church because of who they are as millennials. This too needs some explaining, so like I said, stick with me. To make sense out of the 2 startling claims I have just made, you will need to grasp or come to understand a very important insight into the inner strugglings and progressive mindset of Latter-day Saint millennials. and that is this: that Latter-day Saint millennials who experience this faith crisis do so as part of a much deeper and far more influential woke crisis. Now let me take a moment to explain what millennials and postmillennials mean by the use of this slang term woke, W-O-K-E. And this is important to understand because it is this wokeism that is leading to our disastrous downfall and to the societal demise that I referred to earlier. Here is a definition of woke. Woke is a slang term associated with left-wing politics, progressive or socially liberal causes such as anti-racism, LGBTQ rights, feminism, and environmentalism, and is a clarion call for left-wing radicals fixated on canceling out everything and anything that isn't woke enough at that moment. The clarion call to stay woke is advertised everywhere nowadays, and is a reminder to millennials and post-millennials especially that wokeness is not a virtue or mindset to be taken for granted, but must be nurtured and cared for in the multicultural and intersectional trenches of today's social justice and identity politics battlefields. With this in mind, let us return to our previous slide for further clarification. Now that you know what it means to be woke, let's return to the earlier observation that I made that when Latter-day Saint millennials experience this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis, that they do so within a far deeper and far more influential woke crisis. Here then is how this works. One of the deep and troubling concerns of most millennials and progressive liberals on the left is this uneasy sense or unspoken question of, am I woke enough? Now the reason this question troubles them so much is because they know instinctively that the answer to this question is no, never. Because no one can ever be woke enough. Not celebrities, not politicians, not media analysts, not liberal commentators, nor left-wing professors, and not even social justice warriors, because it's simply impossible to be woke enough. And this is because the very idea or definition of what it means to be woke is a fast-moving target and changes every moment of every day. And it is this uncertainty and anxiousness that creates the perpetual woke crisis that I am talking about. It's this haunting and worrisome notion that I am not woke enough, nor can I stay woke long enough to even relax for a split second. And so I must watch my every word at each and every moment of time, lest I slip up and find myself compromised, then shamed, then temporarily ostracized, and finally, if the breach was serious enough, when it's permanently canceled as a deplorable and unworthy human being. For Latter-day Saint millennials, this internal and often unacknowledged woke crisis leads to and is a major instigator of this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis, because immediately following the question of, am I woke enough, is the equally troubling and vexing question of, is the church woke enough? And again, the answer is no, never. For the church itself, just like the individual, can never be woke enough, nor stay woke long enough to keep itself out of hot water from the woke police and from eventually being publicly shamed, openly ostracized, and finally permanently canceled from the ever-shrinking woke list of acceptable institutions deserving our moral and financial support. It is this fact that the church can never and will never be woke enough in the eyes of the woke police, not morally, culturally, nor politically, that eventually leads to this faith crisis that the church, in the final analysis, does not deserve our support, either morally or financially, and furthermore, must be stopped from doing any further harm. And this is why post-Mormons cannot simply leave the church and leave it alone, because morally their woke conscience won't allow it. And this is because this woke conscience has become, for them, the voice of God and the will of God in all things woke. Sometimes an illustration helps. So here I have a picture of a bunch of loggers scrambling for their lives atop the rolling logs in a dangerous logjam, while in the middle of a raging river with this mountain of timber logs tumbling, piling up, and thrashing all around them. Notice that there would be no logjam without the surrounding terrain and underlying forces of the raging river beneath them. Well, let the loggers represent the millennials and postmillennials. Let the individual logs represent the various issues that trouble the younger generations within the church. And let the logjam represent all the combined factors coming together at once and leading to their faith crisis. Now, it is true that the timber logs play their part in creating this logjam, which leads to the faith crisis. But my point is that there would be no faith crisis without the underlying terrain, forces, and pressures of the raging river, or woke crisis, that created the logjam or faith crisis in the first place. In other words, for the loggers to not pay attention to the current conditions of the raging river, or wider context, while simply concentrating all their attention on the timber logs, is a huge and life-threatening error on their part. And it is the same when it comes to this underlying woke crisis, which represents the wider context within which the faith crisis takes place. Again, if there is no underlying and raging river and treacherous terrain, then there would be no logjam. Likewise, if there is no underlying and raging woke crisis, then there would be no faith crisis. And so, while millennials and postmillennials are complaining about the logjam or faith crisis they are caught up in, they have either completely ignored or remained oblivious to the underlying conditions and treacherous terrain of the raging river or woke crisis that ultimately is responsible for the driving forces and pressures beneath this disastrous and perilous scenario pictured here. So I hope that this illustration has helped in trying to convey what I am getting at. That is, that this millennial faith crisis takes place within a much larger and far more influential woke context or woke crisis that these millennials and postmillennials are literally swimming in on a daily and non-stop basis. Now you may be thinking that I have over-exaggerated the powerful influence that this woke crisis and woke movement plays in a Latter-day Saint faith crisis, at least as it applies to Latter-day Saint millennials and postmillennials. But I assure you that I have not. In fact, if anything, I have understated its full impact, which leads me to ask two further questions in this ongoing inquiry. First, who exactly are these woke millennials? After all, not every millennial or postmillennial is a progressive liberal or cultural Marxist. But whenever I speak of millennials and postmillennials, I am speaking in generational terms, and I am not calling out specific individuals who may or may not conform to these generational beliefs, norms, and attitudes that do pervade the great majority of these younger generations. And this leads me to ask the second question. Once we've identified exactly who these woke millennials are, should we as a church be worried? As I wind down this episode, let me take a quick stab at answering both these questions. In answer to the first question, it is my contention that millennials on a generational scale are a captured operation who have been caught up into a dark, ominous, and powerful woke vortex that is made up of three intertwined components of a philosophical, cultural, and political nature, and whose influence in our day most Latter-day Saints are totally oblivious to. These three intertwined and influential components go by the names of postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and cultural Marxism, and are ideologies which have infiltrated and permeated our institutions of higher learning for decades, and which have now captured an entire generation of millennials into its woke vortex, and is in the process of capturing an entire generation of post-millennials as we speak. All of these terms will be explained and explored in later episodes, But for now, all you need to know is that when one comes face to face with a millennial or a postmillennial, one is coming face to face with some degree or form of radical skepticism, moral relativism, and identity politics, all three of which are promoted and disguised under the politically correct umbrella of social justice. Now, you yourself may not see these millennials or postmillennials in such harsh, ominous, and pigeonholed terms, but the sooner you do see things this clearly, the sooner we will be able to address the larger woke crisis and woke movement that we are currently facing. In any event, this leads us to the second question. Given who these millennials are, should we as a church be worried? I'll allow you to answer that question for yourself, but regardless of how you answer it, you should prepare yourself as a Latter-day Saint for a future coming to terms with a woke Jesus, a woke gospel, and a woke plan of salvation, all of which can never be woke enough. If you doubt this, just remember that we baby boomers are old, and millennials and postmillennials are young, and so generationally speaking, it is just a simple matter of these younger woke generations biding their time, conquering the day, and championing their cause by merely waiting the older generations out and letting nature run its course. The fact of the matter is that Latter-day Saint baby boomers and millennials are not morally, culturally, or politically all birds of a feather. And with this wokeism and generational disconnect so vast and divisive, one might wonder whether a generational reconnect in our day is even possible. Well, in the first place, something's going to give, because the current state of affairs within the church is unsustainable. The disconnect is simply too vast, too divisive, and too absolute. After all, for the church to accommodate the baby boomers by sticking with traditional and orthodox views pertaining to temple marriage and the gender roles of the sexes in the eternal worlds is to create a woke faith crisis in the millennials. And yet, on the other hand, to try and accommodate the millennials by introducing a woke Jesus, woke gospel, and woke plan of salvation is to create not only a faith crisis, but an existential crisis among the baby boomers. And yet, something's got to give. Otherwise, this woke standoff between baby boomers and millennials will remain unresolved, and eventually the wire will snap from all the weight and tension surrounding these woke issues, and all will be lost as the exasperated and disheartened church birds scatter to the four winds. And so, yes, we have a generational, and at this moment in time, an unrepairable disconnect within and without the church between the older generations and the younger. And so as long as the younger generations of millennials and postmillennials insist upon staying woke, this disconnect will remain unrepairable. As I stated earlier, I'm not here to pick on the millennials and postmillennials, but on the contrary, I'm here to sway as many Latter-day Saint millennials and postmillennials as possible to turn away from the powerful influences of this wider social, cultural, and political context, or woke vortex, that they have been caught up in, and help avert a woke disaster of biblical or big potatoes proportions, and which will inevitably result in our societal demise. Together, this disconnect, this coming cultural crisis, and eventual societal demise can be averted, but not without the millennials and postmillennials making a dramatic, unexpected, and life-altering shift in their way of thinking about the woke world in which they live. We older generations can help facilitate this shift, but in the end, only the millennials and postmillennials can save themselves from themselves. Given the shift away from postmormonism and the faith crisis movement, and the shift towards postmodernism and the woke crisis movement among millennials and postmillennials, I've decided to finish off this series of episodes and to start a second series under the heading of Unmasking Postmodernism and the Woke Crisis Movement. I will, however, have at least one more episode in this current series, as I still have a great deal to say about the YouTube video we just finished watching, and how this millennial faith crisis relates to this millennial woke crisis, and to this new series of podcasts that I will be starting shortly. Now, if heady topics such as postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and cultural Marxism seem a bit much for you to take on at this time in your life, just remember that you knew little or nothing at all about post-Mormonism, red-pilling, cognitive dissonance, or historicity when we first started this current series. And besides, just as this post-Mormon-induced faith crisis is coming our way, whether we like it or not, so likewise is this postmodern-induced woke crisis. So, like it or not, we best brush up on these ideas and ideologies so we at least know what we, our children, our grandchildren, and the church itself are up against in this post-Mormon age of rage. And to give you just a small taste of what this postmodern, progressive, and cultural Marxist age of rage looks like in our day, let's end this current episode with a short segment from a different YouTube video of a post-millennial's perspective on climate change and her obvious outrage over the global warming crisis that she is both horrified and terrified by, and which she holds the older generations totally responsible for. And just remember, as you are viewing this, that this is what is coming our way non-stop and in spades from this woke generation.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?